Hey there, it's Dan Kenner with episode number 104 of the podcast. Today we're talking to Jake Lynch about he leveraged his passion and I guess inspiration for writing to complete a project that he never thought that he would. We dive into how he got into writing, where the inspiration came from, and what's happening today. His book is very interesting, and it's a lot about mental health and a narrative around becoming more healthy and just dealing with these challenges of mental health. So I think you'll really enjoy that conversation if you want to stick around for that. Now, I'm sure you've gathered that there was no podcast last week, and there's something that I've discovered being a casual author. My my life can't always run on a perfect schedule, but when things get too far off kilter, the time just doesn't match up in order for me to get everything prepared. So I had this conversation with Jake a little while ago with the intent to publish this last week. But, given COVID striking randomly out of nowhere, and then, work getting a little bit wild, it just didn't happen last week. So that's how generally this podcast will be once per week. And when I do decide to take break here and there, I will try to notify you ahead of time. But, life happens, and that's what happened last week. So here we are today. We're picking it back up. It's crazy to think that we are already nearly to the end of the first month of 2024. And, that's just the way life goes. It just continues surging forward, regardless of whether or not we're ready for it. But I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for the things that happened last year, for the things that I was able to accomplish. And I'm looking forward to this year in terms of both authoring as well as homesteading. Now, a lot has happened since the last time we've had this conversation. I'm just trying to decide where the best place to start is. Firstly, it's kind of interesting from a homestead standpoint how this month has not been too cold. This time last year and the year before, the most bitter days happened end of January into the middle of February. And we're seeing some unusually warm weather on the forefront, which I'm grateful for. I'll never complain about. But, it's only getting down to about mid 20s, low 20s at night. And then it's going above freezing near upper 30s, low 40s. And so everything's melting. And it's good, except for on animals, it's kind of tricky. It's not good for their health to have these weather patterns that are bouncing back and forth. That's where they can get sicknesses, they can get colds, they can get flus, and other things that are just not good for temperature changes for animals. So hopefully the animals are doing okay with these wild changes. I mean, we were looking at negative 15-degree weather less than a week ago, and now bam, suddenly it's warm. Just trying to be cognizant of that. The chickens seem to be doing very fine. They don't care, other than their egg production does have a little bit of a dip when it gets very, very cold out. That's probably because they're not out in the sun as much. They're, staying in their warm coop, out of the wind, out of the cold. They need sun to produce those eggs. So I think that's likely the best explanation for why the eggs dip. Other than that, we did move some goats around. We shifted some goats around, which now the moms and the one baby that we've kept, Malo, are all together again, and they're happy as can be. We'll probably end up just putting them all together at one point because I will be heading to a writers' conference middle of next month, and it's just easier to manage them all if they're all in one place. Now, that does mean that the stinky buck will get his smell on everything, but oh well, it is just the nature of life. We just deal with the smell and wait until we can move him back and let the doze off gas, so to speak, from his smell. That's the fun things that they don't talk about when they say they have goats. But yeah, other than that, everything's gonna stay the same. Now, this year, we're actually gonna be taking a step back a little bit from our homesteading. And that is primarily because this is an announcement. We are actually having another baby. So my wife is pregnant with baby number 7, which we're very, very excited about. But the baby is due literally right on my birthday in the middle of summer. So, given the nature of being pregnant and then having a baby to take care of, we aren't going to be going as crazy on the homestead stuff. We just know ourselves. My wife is a very big go-getter, so I'm just reminding her, hey, it's okay to be a go-getter. We just need to be aware of we don't want to accidentally set ourselves up for something that will ultimately cause stress later. For example, we are still going to have a garden. And probably just not the size of garden we had last year. It was huge last year. Tons of harvesting, tons of preserving. Now that's okay when you don't have a brand new baby. to take care of, and not to mention the exhaustion and the not sleeping. So we're gonna have a smaller garden. We probably aren't going to be doing as many meat chickens as we did the year before. I think it's okay because we have a stock from last year. We did a lot last year and the year before, so we should be able to make it if we just do a smaller batch this year. Um, and we won't be needing to get a new flock of egg layers because this one is new. So that's good. Hopefully next year everything will have settled a little bit more. But it's just the reality. We talk, my wife and I talk all the time about the reality of life, and we like to say there's times and seasons. There's times and seasons where you can spend more time on something, maybe an interest or a passion, and then there's times where you might not be able to because life ebbs and flows, and that's okay. You just go with the punches, and you accept that time of life as best as you can and work it in. So that's what homesteading is going to look like this year. Now, things may change if there's complications. Heaven forbid, there haven't been in the past, but you never know. Or, maybe we're feeling better than we expected. So we'll kind of play it by ear. The plan is to not inundate ourselves with unnecessary work. That being said, on the author front, I am hoping to you know, kick it into high gear in terms of finding my readers. The one thing that I am good at is writing books. The things that I'm not great at is post-production selling. Now, I think that's very common for authors. Finding your readers is such a challenge in this world of noise and just content everywhere. I'm hoping to pinpoint that and identify who those readers are. Now, my first objective this year is I'll be going to a writers conference in Provo, Utah. So if you're going to, it's called Life, the Universe, and Everything conference in Provo, Utah, in the middle of February. I will be there selling books. If you'd love to meet up, let me know. I'd love to say hello, maybe go get a drink or something. But looking forward to that. It's my first conference, and getting everything prepared has been interesting. We'll see how it actually goes. I'm not necessarily going to be disappointed if I don't sell tons and tons of books. I think more than anything, just getting out there, having those conversations, having practice actually talking about my book will be helpful because that's not something I do a lot of. In other news, I did finish the draft of Demon Blooded. So that is book two of the Hidden Heritage series. It's a YA kind of portal fantasy series that will have 6 books. So I just finished book number two. It's probably going to sit in draft form for a while. I have 3 books in first draft form that I'm having a hard time coming back to. Revisions are something that I need to have a little bit better attitude about. And I'm still working on that. So they're still sitting there. Will it get published? Yes, absolutely. I'm feeling like I might want to write the third book so I have half of the books ready to publish and then write the next 3 potentially for publishing in rapid succession. I don't think I'm going to be patient enough to wait until all 6 books are completed. But who knows? I mean, I may surprise myself. And then today I'm just taking a little bit of break. I literally wrote the end about 3 days ago. So I'm gonna take a little bit of break from writing and then dive into, I haven't decided quite yet what to do next. Either book 3 of The Hidden Heritage, or I'll go back and do book 2 of the series that is currently unnamed. It is an epic fantasy series. The first book is called The Etcher's Plight. And because it's an epic fantasy, it is quite a big endeavor. That will be a 4-book series. Now, the irony is, I have people ask me this all the time. If you're a discovery writer, how do you know how many books there are in the series? The answer is, I have no idea. I just know. I've always been right about it. And even though I don't know plot wise what's going to happen in each of the books, all I know is the concept is enough to fill that number of books. And I haven't been wrong yet, but I mean, still young. I could easily be wrong. Maybe this quote unquote 6-book series ends up being 3. It's not going to be 3. It's too complicated. I've created a lot of tumult to finish in one more book, but you never know. Maybe it'll only be 4. In any case, I just try to follow that feeling and go with it. And if something changes, I don't complain about it. You just go with the punches. Other than that, yeah, just trying to figure out what's the best way to find the right audience for my books so that I can start capturing back some of that revenue and pouring it back into books. I don't anticipate becoming super um, wealthy from the books that I have written, at least not yet. However, if I could have some more money to invest back into the system, then I would not cry. If it could pay for itself, then I would absolutely love that situation. That is kind of the goal of 2024, to reach that point, or at least have moved in that direction. Um, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm not a huge goal maker, but that is kind of the attitude or the general trends that I'm going to be focusing on for this year. Now, there's a lot that goes into that, some direct sales. Maybe I'll get up enough courage to do a Kickstarter at some point. I'm not there yet, but you never know. Bear with me. I may cough here and there with my recovering from COVID. In any case, I believe those are all the updates for today. Looking forward to this interview with Jake. So I hope you enjoy that. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing very well. I'm thrilled to talk to you about your book and your publishing experience. Before we get into that fun stuff, how long have you been writing and publishing?
I've been writing for about 5 years now, I gotta say. I started writing in December of 2018,
Okay.
and here we are, 5 years exactly. So that's how long I've been writing. I got my first book published recently, so yeah,
So you're feeling pretty good about that.
I'm feeling very happy about that. I'm not gonna lie.
So is this since 2018 when you began writing, has it been this story the entire time, or has it been you dabbling in various other stories
I'm
until
gonna
you got
say,
to this point?
I'm gonna say majority of it was writing this one story. Obviously, there were some times when I took a break and tried to dabble in writing a couple other stories, but like nothing major. So, but a lot of it was focused on this one story.
Mhm. How was it taking I say this, it's okay to take your time on a story. Did you ever tire out from the story? I mean, you said you took some breaks, but how did you continue with the resolve in writing this single story for so long?
Man, I'm not gonna lie to you. This was a hard journey. Like this was like by far the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. And but the journey was so worth it. But like, oh man, I was like, I'd say like a year into trying to write it, I was very discouraged and I almost gave up, but I just grit my teeth and just moved on. I'm just like, I know God wants me to write this book, so I'm gonna write this book whether I like it or not. And because what else am I gonna do? So I stuck to it and I kept going, and now here I am.
I mean, I think that's awesome. So was there a turning point in that decision, like a almost a there doesn't have to be, but I'm curious to know if there was an instance in your life that made you realize, no, this has to happen.
Yeah, so it kind of like goes into how I got started writing essentially.
Sure.
And so basically like how I got started writing is kind of unique. It's not like most authors or most other people. You'll hear other authors say, "Oh, I've always wanted to write a book since I was in third grade,"
Hmm.
or "I've always been a huge reader and I've always had this idea on my mind." I was not like that at all. In fact, I'm the total opposite. I was not a big reader. I still have a hard time reading, but I still do read. And English in high school was not my favorite subject. It was one of my least favorite subjects. I'm sorry, high school teachers, if you're listening to this, but I was not that guy who loved reading Catcher in the Rye or Romeo and Juliet. Like I was the total opposite. I like doing math. So
Hmm.
I'm like 2 + 2 = 4. That makes sense. But if you ask me to write a paragraph about how I feel, I'm like, what's the formula for this? So going back to the original question, uh, I was just finishing the first semester in my sophomore year. So I was 19 at the time, and I was studying business management out in college at the University of Utah. Great school, by the way. And so I had just finished a very, very stressful semester. I like almost failed my accounting class, which was very like stressful to me because I take my school very seriously. So the fact of failing a class was like the absolute worst possible thing that could happen to me. But luckily, I managed to make it through. So I had just finished a very stressful semester in college, and I got this impression on my mind to write a story about a janitor of like, oh, they're like, what if I wrote a story about a janitor and how he was like a gentleman character and he was very kind to people and helped people with their problems. And that stems because I encountered a janitor on a train one day and he was super nice and joyful, and he just made me feel all happy inside. And so I kept having this impression on my mind, and taking into account I had never written anything in my life up to that point. So it was very new to kind of
Hmm.
get that impression. And it wasn't that type of impression to where it was forceful or anxious. I'm like, no, I feel like I have a choice in the matter, but it's also sticking around. So um, I'm like, okay, this idea is not going away. So I wonder if, if this is really something I should do. So I grew up Christian. And so I learned in church from I went to Saddleback Church growing up under Rick Warren at the time, and Rick Warren taught us that if you want to hear God's voice, stop looking for a voice and start looking for a verse. Okay, so meaning that we should read God's word, we should read the Bible to see if God is speaking to us or not. So what I did was I'm like, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to pray about this. So I sit down, I take a quiet time, I like total silence. I get down and I pray for a couple minutes, and I'm like, God, do you want me to write a book? And I pray for a little bit, and I flip open to where I was reading in the Bible, and take into account where I was actually reading in the Bible was also unique because I got another impression to start reading a different book in the Bible at that time. So I was reading the New Testament, like prior to that, but I got the impression a couple months prior to this one to start reading the book Isaiah. Okay, and that's in the Old Testament. So I'm like, okay. So I start reading the book of Isaiah, and then like just put that on the side and fast forward to the present time of me getting the impression to write a book about a janitor. I then flip open to where I was reading in the book of Isaiah, and I'm like, God, do you want me to write a book? And there I read the first thing was Isaiah 30, verse 8, which says, write these words down, write it in a book.
Hmm.
And I'm just like, okay, God wants me to write a book now. Like, you can't get more clear than that. And so I started writing. I started writing 1 to 2 hours a day, whether I wanted to or not. I just did it. I'm like, all right, I think God wants me to write a book. So that's how I got started writing.
I mean, I think that is very unique. I did happen to be one of those people that have wanted to write a book my whole life, but like you, I was also a math and science kid. So the idea
Hmm.
of writing a book was like, that's never going to happen. I just assumed it would never happen, not out of negativity, just out of, I don't have the skill. That's not a skill that I have. So you're not alone in
Yeah.
that. However, I have always wanted to write a book. I did also start in 2018. So
Oh,
kind of
really?
crazy coincidental. It was around December 2018. So
Oh, man.
the
That's
stars are aligning or something.
it's,
I don't know. Although mine was less divine inspiration, more just a challenge from a friend. But we're not here to talk about me.
that's
Um,
okay.
I think that's really interesting, though, and that specifically this story. So I think it's prudent to dive into it a little bit, obviously, without giving spoilers or talking too much about the book. So you did write the book about the janitor, sounds like, but
Uh,
I would imagine that it's a lot more complex than just a book about a kind-hearted janitor. So let's
mhm.
what is the book about?
Well, so like, here's the thing. The janitor was kind of like the catalyst to start the process. So as I wrote the journey, it evolved more and more into something else.
Sure.
And so by the time that I finished the book, I had a completely different product. So the janitor doesn't have as big a role in the story, but he still has a role, but he's not the main character, actually.
Hmm.
What happened was I developed a new main character named Crystal, and she's a high school girl who struggles with suicide and depression, essentially. She's like perpetually sad. So like she doesn't have a reason to have hope in life, because why should she have hope if no one's ever loved her? And so she's a shy girl growing up in high school and has to deal with being like how to interact in high school, like how do you make friends in high school, but then dealing with that and suicidal tendencies and depression of like how do I find hope when no one loves me, when no one cares about me, etc. And so the book kind of takes that on and targets a lot of current issues within schools and just within society these days that a lot of people don't talk about but know about. So that's that on like in a nutshell a little bit. But that obviously, if you read the book, there's a lot more to it.
Yes, that's that's to be sure. So I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration for the content because this is a very heavy and potent subject, particularly in our day and age, where a lot of these challenges are more prevalent, particularly in the youth of the world. So where did you draw your inspiration as you were writing the main character, her perspective, as well as the challenges she was experiencing?
Like it was such a jumble of ideas and scenes and events that happened that like by the time that I wrote it, I didn't fully realize what I had written in essence. Like I was still trying to develop how to write a story for the very first time. That by the time I wrote it, I was like, okay, so that's how this is. Oh, okay. But like in terms of inspiration, obviously like every author puts a little bit of themselves within every story or character, whether they realize that or not. And for me, you know, some of it was intentional, but then some of it was not intentional. So it really changed things a little bit as time went on. So by the time I was done with it, I was like, yeah, that's how it turned out, and it's great.
I mean, I think that's awesome. And it's not something that you can always plan ahead for, right? Particularly when, so did you plot out the story before you got into it, or was it kind of you figured it out as you went?
See, like that was the beauty of the whole 5 year journey, which is why it took me 5 years, was that I had to learn how I write
Yeah.
in that 5 year period. And, I was still writing like part time. I was still going to college, doing all my classes, working jobs, whatever. And so I was writing 1 to 2 hours a day. And so, like, I had to learn, am I a pantser or a plotter, and how I write a story essentially. So my first year writing it, I did what every author should not do, which is edit it while you're writing it.
Mm.
And so I would write one chapter. I wrote one chapter and I would edit it as I was writing it. I see, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I do
You're
know what
like,
you're
that's
talking about.
so, and I did that for a full year, and it was very discouraging
Hmm.
that I did that. So, like, I learned like that was where I got really discouraged and where I almost gave up actually. But through that discouragement, I let it change my direction a little bit and how I wrote. So instead of just like writing it and editing it as I went, I'm like, I'm gonna do the full plotter route and just plot every single moment, every single detail. So I took a notebook and wrote all the details. And that's where more of the characters kind of came into being. And that's where the main character, Crystal, kind of started. Uh, and so I did like a full year of trying to do the plotter route. But then I ended up never writing the story. And so I'm like, oh, shoot. I'm like, I never know what's fully going to happen, even though I'm trying to plot it out.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, okay, so the plotter route isn't working. And so I tried to do the pantser route. And so I did the pantser route. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna just free write, like I'm gonna free write it, I'm gonna write it and just find out. But and I'm not gonna plan anything, but I'm not gonna edit it either. And so I did that for another year. So it was like 2 to 3 years now already. And what the problem was, I would free write the story. I would be a pantser, but I would never know how to finish it or where the story was going. And
Mm.
I would just get lost in my own story essentially. And so I I got discouraged again, but I didn't give up. And that was when I had to do my homework. I had to I'm like, all right, you know what, screw this. I'm going to read some books on how to write books essentially. And so I read a couple books on how to write. I read a book from Stephen King on how he writes, and
Hmm.
another book on like pantser or plotter. What are the two essentially? And I'm like, oh, that's what they are. But and so it took me another year to kind of get my groove down. And I'm like, okay, this time I'm going to do a hybrid of both, actually. I'm going to try to plot like vaguely where the story goes, but I'm still going to free write in between the major points. I'm like, okay, this happens to this character, but I'm not going to tell you how, when, or where. So there's a build up to that. And so that took me another year to finally get down until we're finally there. And I'm like, oh, now I know how to write the story.
And so you did. So the final
It's,
year, I guess, was the completion and editing. I'm assuming you did some amount of editing on it.
I had to do so much editing on it. It
Yes.
drove me crazy.
That's why the whole editing as you go thing makes me want to pull my hair out because I don't even like editing when it's fully done. But no, I think it's amazing that you talked about your experience because I think so many authors, particularly myself as well, went through the phase of it was less so for me that how do I write this? Am I doing it the right way? Because I've known for a while that I don't fit into molds very well.
Mm.
Um, and so, and I don't like planning. I really don't. So I learned very, very quickly that I'm a discovery writer. Although it took me writing 2 books before someone told me, "Oh, you're a discovery writer." I was like, "Cool." I didn't even know what that was. I intentionally distanced myself from all of these, like, this is how you do X, this is how you do Y. Not because I think I can do it better, but because I just know myself. I needed to discover my own way. And it took writing books to discover that for me. So now that I've discovered myself, I can go back and easily discard things like, nope, I know that won't work for me because I know the way my brain works. But your discovery phase just happened while you were writing your book. Mine happened when I had finished a couple of books, but it
Wow.
had to happen, right? The discovery thing is just it's just part of writing. Um,
Yeah.
so, but I mean, it's great that you shared that experience, and I am very impressed that you stuck to the story after
I
so many
was,
years without getting bored or lost or whatever. Um,
I
but I bet
felt
it's
all
probably
of that.
satisfying, very
Oh,
satisfying.
it did. Like, I had like, it was the most joyful day of my life when I finally like got my book in my hand and
Mhm.
like it was done. Like after all of that hard, bitter work, I finally completed it. Like it's like that's gonna go down as one of the moments in my life where I'm gonna say that was one of the happiest moments in my life. Like not like graduating college or winning a baseball game growing up. It was I wrote my first book and I published it because it was hard and I accomplished something that was very difficult, but I stuck to it and I did it. And that's what made it so worthwhile.
I think that's an incredible feeling, and I every time I finish a book, I feel that same thing. So
Oh, that's
I am
awesome.
curious, and if you don't have any sense of this, that's totally fine. But because of the inspiration that you felt went into the beginning of this book, do you feel like you have so far fulfilled that request from on high, or do you feel like there's more to come? That he wants more for you and this book?
I would say generally yes. I still like I will in the future write a book called The Janitor in the
Uh-huh.
future. Like I'll get around to that, but like now I have a lot more ideas in my head that are spinning around that I want to get down. So like I will get to that eventually. But for the time being, I'm gonna focus on some other things. But for the most part, I think the dream is relatively complete.
I mean, I think that's awesome. So that has an extra fulfillment factor to
Mhm.
it because you there was another presence or another force that was encouraging you to do it, and so you finally did it, and I bet that feels great. So,
Yeah.
so that being said, I guess what is the future of this story? Is this anticipated to be a series? Do you see Crystal coming back in later stories, or is this a one-time standalone story?
I think for the time being, this is a one-time standalone story. I mean, I do have other ideas that I will write down the road to where I might do an Easter egg or two where I involve
Mm.
Crystal, but it'll be for someone else's story. So like same universe, but will it be a sequel? No, it will not be. Like this book was so unique in its style and writing that I don't think I want to give it a sequel yet. So I'm going to say that this is a one time event.
Hey, nothing wrong with that. Also, nothing wrong with creating sequels, and also okay not knowing. I think, the way the world is going and the way the human mind works, anything could change tomorrow. So I
Anything
was
can
just curious
change.
if you had plans. Some people make very copious plans for the books that they're writing, so wasn't sure if that existed or not.
Yeah, not that I don't have other ideas. Like I'm getting started on other works as well, and I got a lot of work ahead of me, so I'm very excited for what comes next.
I mean, I think it's awesome being excited. That's the key to writing
Hmm.
and not losing your resolve. So let's talk a little bit about the process, right? You talked
Okay.
about the writing, um, as you're making shifts of, okay, try this process, doesn't work, does work, here's where I should be editing and whatnot. Were there any points where you felt like you had to change your mindset to a point where you had a more positive perspective of writing? Because it sounds like there maybe had some discouraging times during that.
Yeah, it was really strange as I did it because when I started this writing process, I actually hated it.
Hmm.
Like I was like it was very tough for me to sit myself down for an hour, 2 hours, and to write just for an hour to 2 hours when I was working. I was doing like in college, or I could be hanging out with friends or doing other stuff. So it was very hard to do that at first. Um, and so like, I would get a little bitter and I would just be clenching my teeth. I was as I was typing away, but I still did it. But what was unique about it is that the longer I did it, the more meaningful it became.
Hmm.
And because of that, I then started to enjoy it more because I started thinking, well, what am I going to be doing with my time? Because, it's very easy to slack off. It's very easy for me to watch YouTube and to just play video games or just, do something. But as I started doing that, I started learning that like, oh no, this is actually very productive, and I get a good sense of elation from being productive doing this. It's kind of like working out, essentially. You discipline yourself and you wake up at 6 a.m. so that you can work out and you get a good hard pump in, a good hard work in. And once you're finished with your workout, you're like, I got something done today. I got something done. And that's just how it became as time went on.
I think that's a really important thing to mention because there are a lot of authors who, maybe they're at the starting phase and they think, oh, this is going to feel good. It's going to be so exciting every single time. I mean, the reality of it is not every writing session is peaches. Sometimes they're not
No.
great. But the writing, for like you mentioned, just the writing forward, keep moving forward, then the momentum does pick up and you eventually kind of fall in love with the process. That's what I found
Yeah.
happened to me. I
It,
remember
it
with my first book, I just had the story mine. I was like, I'll just write it and see what happens. And I haven't been able to stop writing. So
wow.
I just can't. Like every day. It's not even there are distractions and some days I'm like, oh, I don't really feel like writing. But if I get to the end of the day and I haven't written, I'm like, I don't care how late I have to stay up. I have to do it just because I just want to. Like it's just part of my life now. I can't let it go. So is that where you've reached yourself? Because you published this book a couple weeks ago, right? So you've had
Yeah.
some time between hitting publish and now. Do you find yourself being drawn to the page again?
Yeah. After doing that whole process of like writing it, editing it, and now promoting it, I find that I like the writing side of it. I like the creativity side of it a lot more nowadays than before I did. So I'm very eager to get back and write the next story. I'm like, I want to write the next story, but I'm like, no, I got to edit this story right now. So I got to put that off for the time being.
Well, and then there's the marketing side of things. So now you have this book. Now it's
Yes.
the delivering this book, getting the word out to the billions of people in the world who might be able to benefit from the story.
Yes.
So how are you doing that? Have you thought about how you're going to do that? Do you have a specific target audience you're trying to reach with this book?
Yeah. So marketing itself is a job in itself.
Hmm.
So my target audience is high schoolers and young adults. One of the things that I found though was that the book is highly relatable to people of all ages. So it's not just meant for high schoolers or anything. It can be meant for adults as well because everyone goes through high school at
Mm,
some point.
mm,
So like that's my target audience for now. And in the ways that I'm marketing it, I'm trying to be more active on social media. So I'm posting weekly on Instagram, and I have a newsletter email list that I'm trying to be active on. And I'm doing the cold calling. So I'm cold calling churches and high schools and any place that will let me speak and showcase my book there. And obviously I'm still new to this whole process, so I feel that there's some lessons to be learned down the road or even right now. So I'm trying my best right now, trying to market it through social media, but social media really does work.
yes, like you wouldn't believe. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but yes, I've been through the ringer, so to speak, with social media, and
Yeah,
I am currently on a downswing of social media.
really.
So, but I know there's a lot of people that love it. They thrive in the environment, and I think it's amazing. Something that I do struggle with.
Yeah.
Um, and I think a lot of it comes from just the sifting of truth and not truth, if that makes sense,
Uh,
in social media because it's so easy to be deceived. I say that, and I don't necessarily mean that from necessarily just a spiritual point, but just from a human moral standpoint. Um, and
I
so,
get you.
I found myself so exhausted trying to sift through it and
Hmm.
understand. I was just like, yeah, I don't have the mental capacity. I have 6 children to raise right now. That's what I need to focus on. But that being said, in the time that you have been in social media, are there any tips or tricks that you might offer to someone who is looking to get into it for their authoring?
You got to be consistent about it. I would say being consistent is what helps generate the feed, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So be consistent at it and don't be afraid to ask people for help either, because there are some people who are more proficient at the social media thing than I am. And I'm always welcome. I always welcome their help and what they do because they show me things that I never knew
Mm-hmm.
about it. And like for me, like the social media thing is a little awkward because I'm an introvert. I don't like to throw myself out into the world and shout out, hey, everybody, look at me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like doing that. But at the same time, I have to do that if I want to get the word out. So be consistent and don't be afraid to ask people for help and for ideas on what you can do as well, because it is a lot of work and you have like, there's only so much time during the day. So ask others for help.
Absolutely. I mean, I just think in general, that's the one thing is I'm sure you've learned this as well as a newer author. It can feel very isolating being an author, which is
Yeah.
ironic because there's however many hundreds of thousands, nearly millions of people who are also writing books and are
Mm-hmm.
experiencing the challenges of writing and editing. And
Yeah.
but when it's just you and the page, you feel very alone. You're like lost or confused or frustrated. But as you build your author network, you feel less alone. So always ask for help. There's nothing wrong with that.
Always ask for help and be consistent at it.
I love that absolutely. So what other advice do you have for someone who might be in the middle of writing their story, whether they've been writing for 3 months, 2 months, or 10 years? Do you have any other little tidbits of advice to help them drive forward to write the end?
I'm going to say that it is a hard journey, and that's why not many people do become authors. But by being disciplined and saying no to what you want to procrastinate
Hmm.
and saying yes to getting the work done, that is a very mature thing to do. So I would say stick to it, keep writing, like keep going. You will make it to the finish line. I know it's a hard journey, but it's act like the journey itself is developing you a
Hmm.
lot more than you realize.
I mean, that is an interesting point. You would probably say that you're a different person today than you were 5 years ago when you started writing.
I am a very different person today. Like it was really strange because as like I know it took me 5 years to write this whole thing, but because I went through that grind, that work and frustration, I realized I started to change in some positive ways, actually. For example, writing this book has taken me 5 years. And when you're expecting and you're working on something for 5 years, you can get a little impatient at times.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I learned was that, like, because I got delayed so much, or I had to rewrite something and work on it, and it took me so long, I started becoming more patient, actually. I'm like, all right, it's another delay. Like, getting mad is not going to change anything. I'm going to take it. I'm going to move on. I'm going to learn from it. And I started to become more patient because of that. And like less things bother me as much now. And I'm like, oh, wow, like this, like writing this story is actually changing the way that I live my life and how I view life. And that's a good thing. So I like, even though think it is a hard thing to do, the journey, it's really all about the journey more than the destination.
Absolutely. That's it's one of those sayings that seems obvious, but becomes less obvious the more distracted we get by things. But really, yeah, the journey. Um, I love everything that you said there, and I can agree. And
Mm-hmm.
this is a very transformational story. Even just from I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I would like to. Um, but just even from the understanding of the story itself,
Mm-hmm.
and as an author, it's here for the better to
Yeah.
have written it, and hopefully your readers feel the same way
Yeah,
as
and
they
that
get
was
through it.
one of the bigger reasons why I like stuck to it and continued to write it, was because I knew that someone would read this and that someone's life would be changed
Hmm.
from reading this. And so it was kind of my love to reach that person that kept me going, that kept me writing despite the disappointment and the frustration. And so it was, you know, my journey to try and reach you and say, hey, it's going to be okay.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that. Definitely a lot to think about and consider. And those of you who are listening, if you do pick up Jake's book, you have more context in all that went into this book, which I think just makes it even more of an interesting story to read. Um, that's the other thing as an introvert and social media that I'm sure you understand now is when the readers understand the author a little bit more and they know who you are and appreciate who you are, it's more interesting for them to
Mm-hmm.
pick up your book. But if you're like myself, getting out there, being yourself on social media is not easy. And
No.
so it sometimes can feel like a disconnect between reader and author. So
Yeah.
be yourself. That's the other tricky thing.
Be
Well, there's
yourself.
definitely lots of things we could discuss, but we are running a little bit short on time. Before we end here, where can people find more information about you and your books if they want to check it out?
Yeah. So you can find me at my website. It's authorjakelynch.com. That's Lynch as in Lynch. Or you can check me out on Instagram at author Jake Lynch. So those are the two main places to find me. The links will take you to my book and you can purchase them on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
I have enjoyed that conversation. Jake's enthusiasm is very infectious, and his inspiration is very interesting. Literal divine inspiration in his case. But I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind that there's many of us that have a story in our minds that maybe we're afraid to write down, or maybe it just feels like too big of a project, and so we don't want to get started. The answer is get started, and you'll be shocked what you're able to accomplish. So take that with a grain of salt or just take it and run with it, whatever works for you. So next week, we'll actually be talking to Matt Guzman about teaching children emotional health through story. So he writes middle grade stories. I think currently he's working on a 7 book middle grade fantasy story. And he talks about emotional health, his experience with it, his interest with it, and how he incorporates that into books in a realistic way. Because, emotional health is something that everybody needs to learn. Some of us are still learning, let's be honest, but particularly kids, they're going through some developmental stages that are very challenging. And as authors, we can create stories that convey whatever messages we want them to convey. And in his case, he wants to talk about the truth, reality, and the importance of emotional health. So join us for that conversation next week. If you'd like to join me on the podcast, head to thecasualauthor.com, fill out the form, or if you have author friends or family that might be interested in just having a great conversation, having a positive perspective and sharing their passion, their insights on anything related to writing, maybe they're a cover artist or maybe they're a lawyer who assists self-published authors or traditionally published authors. I'd love to have you on the podcast. But yeah, just head to the casualauthor.com, fill out the form, and I'll reach back out to you. I hope you have a lovely week, and I look forward to talking to you next week.